something I want to say about philosophy. During the Middle Ages, European philosophers would debate on what led the pig to the market. They see a man with a rope around a pig's neck, and they would debate, is it the rope that's leading the pig, or is the pig following the rope, or is the pig following the man who's holding the rope? And they would debate this issue back and forth. Some said it was the man, and some said it was the rope. My own personal view is, take the whole idea out. I don't engage in such minute, trivial discussions. So I don't know, but anyway, some of these philosophers. All right, the Chinese have a saying: "There's no idea that's so absurd, but what some philosopher somewhere has uttered it." Every idea that you can think of, good, bad, or in between, has been uttered by some philosopher. So these men had a knack for being so right in some things and yet turning out to be so wrong in others. But anyway, Chu Si is the one I mentioned last time. I believe I left off with him, who tried to explain the universe. This is Japan, by the way, right here. That's coming up next. But Chu Si would explain that we live in between two halves of the universe. We have to encourage the good half and discourage the bad. And we do this by what he called the investigation of things. And his followers have spent 1,000 years debating what that means. Yang Wang Mang disagreed with and said, no, the best way to transcend the material world is to understand yourself. And in both cases, Neo-Confucianism, it never became the official religion of China, probably because the government didn't like the way it was too much like Buddhism, and it did not deal with participation in mundane or worldly affairs. Old-time Confucianism talked about participating in life's events. Neo-Confucianism talked about transcending life's events and getting into the spiritual. And a lot of your Chinese high-up officials were more interested in seeing people deal with the actual material world rather than trying to transcend them. Now, a lot of persons have said that the Chinese philosophers may have been guilty of keeping China from progressing more so than they otherwise would have. I mean, go back to the year 1000. Technologically, China was here and Western Europe was down here. China was the rabbit in the race. Western Europe was the turtle. All of you know which side won that race. Again, the Chinese were more concerned with moral principles. I talked about that at the end of last class. There have been many books written. Why was it Europe and not China that burst out from its seams and overspread the globe? One idea that your book mentions is possibly because the Chinese rated a man on how high he got in the government, how high a government position he was able to acquire or achieve. And in the West, yes, they had government, but then again, a man could achieve in art, he could achieve in music, he could achieve in athletics, he could achieve in science. There was more than one route to where a person could achieve. And in China, it was all government. Even your philosophers, Chu Si held government posts, and Yang Wang Mang held government positions. But in Europe, a lot of your college professors, and yes, Europe had colleges, your university professors did not hold government positions and actually did not want them, didn't feel like they needed to. A lot of scientists didn't. Weirdly enough, one of Europe's greatest scientists, Sir Isaac Newton, wound up with a very high government position late in his life and did quite well at it. But a lot of persons who can do really well in one field might think they can do well in another field, get in the other field and fall flat on their face. if any of you, if all of you live long enough, you'll wind up either experiencing the same thing yourself or seeing someone who does. But just because you're really good at one thing doesn't mean you'll be really good at another. Have any of you in psychology heard of a principle called the Peter Principle? I had some students in the class, some of you who had. Basically, the Peter Principle says, don't ever climb any higher up the bureaucracy than your abilities allow you to go. Notice in the Army, a man might be a really good major, get promoted to lieutenant colonel and fall flat on his face. Or a man might be really good with 1 star on his collar, a general, 1 star, so they promote him to 2-star, and he can't handle it. It's called don't ever go higher than your level of competence will allow you to go. And each of us have this level. Either try to grow up and fill the next level, or just simply stay on the level that you can work at without going any higher. A lot of people have done so well on the lower levels. And another thing too, I believe I mentioned that in this class, China remained united during much of this period. If China had been divided like Europe was, perhaps one of China's nations might have burst out in the seams. In the case of Europe, when Europe had its Industrial Revolution, only Britain and France, northern France, that Britain and northern France and Germany and the United States participated. The rest of Europe remained impoverished. Spain, Portugal, Italy, the Balkan region, and Russia and Poland and Norway and Sweden remained impoverished. Only a few nations in Europe found a way. In China, if they would have had 50 nations, if 1 or 2 of them would have found a way to invent something like an automobile, telephone, telegraph, the Chinese might have actually burst out from their seams and overspread the whole globe and might have exceeded the West. That's one of those might have been what ifs. All right, any questions about China? The people who almost did, but they didn't. At least not until modern times. Now, what I just said about China does not apply to the year 2015. The United States is tottering right on the brink of war with China. And the United States is not afraid of taking China. Pardon me, China is not afraid of taking the United States on either. That's a whole different topic. All right, moving on, chapter 11. Japan, Korea, Vietnam. The United States has fought wars in all 3 countries during the last 100 years. 1, 2 of them, and lost the other one. But, China was looked on by these 3 countries as the middle kingdom, and all 3 countries were very heavily influenced by China. Korea and Vietnam were conquered by China at some point. Japan never was. Japan has been compared to Great Britain. Japan is a series of islands off the coast of mainland Asia. Great Britain is a couple of islands here off the coast of mainland Europe. And the body of water that separates these 2 places from the mainland means that they are free to develop their own culture. They are influenced by the mainland. Both China and Britain are influenced by the mainland, and yet they're able to develop independently. If there were nothing more than a hill separating Britain from France, Britain would be more like France, or France would be more like Britain. As it is, there's a body of water separating the 2. In Japan, there's an even bigger body of water separating it from Asia. And Japan then is influenced by the rest of the continent, particularly by China, but at the same time, different. More free to develop their own unique culture. All 3 of these countries, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, had civil service exams at one time or another. Then these exams would determine who was to receive government positions. Now, as I talk about them, these 3 countries, I would do a lot of comparing of them with modern times, because in a lot of cases, what they have done throughout their history is what they repeated in the 20th century. Vietnam has been really good at fighting guerrilla warfare, and by so doing, they even kept the Mongolians out, and yes, even kept the United States out, and France also. Korea has been divided throughout most of its history, and it still is. Vietnam has been divided throughout much of its history, but is not anymore. These countries, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, have fought a lot of civil wars, within their own self. So of course, in modern times, Japan has not fought a civil war, but Japan has also a tendency toward unity. They've always been united. Something that you can't say for Korea and Vietnam. So they are still united to this day. All right, I wrote these islands on a board. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce them. These are the 4 Japanese islands, main islands. All right. Japan's climate, very important, is moderate. I mean, down here south of Japan, the Philippines, and Japan is industrious. I regret to say the Philippines generally are not. And again, by moderate, that means Japan has a winter, a summer, a spring, and a fall. These tropical places here have only a summertime, and tropical areas tend to not be as industrious as people who live in temperate areas. And folks, if that offends you, I'm just simply stating the facts. I mean, it's just simply the way it is. Something seeming about a tropical climate makes one not feel the urgency. We've got to plow this garden right now because we've got a small window of opportunity. If we don't plow today, it might rain tomorrow and we can't plow. I mean, when my sister lives in Ohio, they had a couple years back where it just rained and rained during the plowing season, and the only day it finally got dry enough to plow was on a Sunday. So all the farmers, even the ones who normally attended church, got out and plowed on Sunday because if they had waited, number one, more rain was coming, and number two, the time for plowing would have passed, and the crops would have been frostbitten before they could be harvested. So, but in other words, the persons who live in temperate climates have to contend with, there's an open season, and right here it's between April 15th and May 10th, generally, for those of you who care at least a bit about planting crops. So it varies a little bit from crop to crop, but April 15th is usually the last frost, and after May 10th, it takes too long for the crops to grow, and you'll not get anywhere. I mean, the crops will get frostbitten before they can be harvested. Most of Japan's people live along the east coast. In other words, on this side of Japan with their backs facing China, you might say. The reason for that is the western part of Japan generally doesn't have a harbor, has a nice smooth seacoast, more suitable for beach going, while the eastern part of Japan, I'm exaggerating a little bit, has a lot of harbors that can shelter ships. So the eastern part of Japan gets warm water coming in from the Pacific. And this warm water warms the eastern part. Now, you might not realize, folks, but the air and the ocean currents flow in streams. Scientists will still go, but for instance, the most famous, biggest stream on Earth is the Gulf Stream. And you might think that when the hot waters from the Gulf Stream goes out of the Gulf, they'd scatter evenly. They don't. They stay in a stream that goes right up here and goes to the North Sea and warms up the northern part of Europe and the southern part of England in a stream. And of course, air currents travel in a stream we call the jet stream. It's hard to explain why that is, but these currents will stay together in an organized fashion. So the Pacific currents make the climate better than it otherwise would be. Now, Japan's soil is rich owing to the fact that Japan is made up of volcanic ash. Now, like the Hawaiian Islands, some volcanoes erupted for generations, and these volcanoes eventually spewed out lava so high that it got above the surface of the water. Then it kept spewing, and finally the volcanoes somewhat died down. The volcano is no longer active, just like the Hawaiian volcanoes, no longer active. But in the place is a bunch of volcanic ash that makes for really, really good soil. Even though regrettably Japan is a difficult place to farm because it's got so many mountains and hillsides. Like Hawaii, volcanic islands tend to be mountainous. Now, On the same topic, did anybody happen to watch the movie that came out about 3 weeks ago called The Martian? Okay, that's okay if you didn't. It's not required. In the other class, only a couple of persons did. But anyway, in The Martian, this fellow who's stranded on Mars farms using Mars dirt. Well, we've had some experiments. We farmed with moon dirt. We brought back the astronauts who went to the moon, brought back some moon soil, and we tried growing some plants. We found out the plants grow better using moon soil than they do using Earth soil. It leads you to wonder, we don't know a thing about Mars. Mars might be an exception. Many years ago, by the time I was born, Robert Anson Heinlein, you've never heard, wrote a book about farming on Jupiter's moon, Ganymede. But we don't know if that could be done or not. Of course, Heinlein didn't know that Jupiter's moon, Ganymede, is half ocean, frozen ocean that is. But he believed it could be done. But what I'm getting at is, owing to the fact that so much of the volcanic ash makes really, really good soil, and the moon makes good soil, makes you wonder if the Earth's surface ground is not cursed. All right, that's more maybe for theology than for in academia, but nevertheless, something seems to be wrong. Now, what's wrong with Earth's soil? Japan is located on a place where two tectonic plates come together. Now, you may know, folk, that the Earth sits on plates, and where these plates come together, they sometimes move. Japan has, down through the centuries, experienced terrible earthquakes. The last one occurred in March 2011, and it was not all that long ago. Before that, there was a terrible earthquake between the wars, around 1923, I believe, that almost leveled the city of Tokyo. They have had some terrible earthquakes. The one they had in 2011, the earthquake caused tidal waves that got into Japan's nuclear plants. The water got into nuclear plants and contaminated that part of the water and contaminated all the ground and area. And it may be many years before that radioactive contamination actually dries up. So crops that are grown there cannot be eaten. Cattle cannot graze in that region because the grass contains radioactivity. And also a bunch of debris was washed into the ocean, and it took months, but eventually a lot of that debris found its way to the western part of the United States and Canada. A ship got loose that nobody wanted, and the Navy finally used it for target practice, blew it to bits and sunk it. Any of you heard any of this by any chance? Yeah, one of you is raising your hand. All right. But yeah, this actually went on. Now, Japanese have a creation myth that said that the world was created when a god and a goddess married, and their offspring was the world. Most primitive societies believe this, but what's unique about Japan is that they're what we call an advanced society that believes this kind of myth also. This myth was instrumental in making the emperor divine, and instrumental in also telling people that they must obey the emperor no matter what. Many people in Japan still believe the emperor is divine, even though after 1945 the emperor officially got up, you might say, on the podium and said that he was not divine. That was part of the peace treaty we signed with him at the end of World War II, but we let him stay in office. And his descendants. Now, Japan is the only country that I know of who's descended from emperors who have been around since at least 600 BCE. They claim their emperor is a separate creation, the race, the divine, and that he's not Japanese at all, even though today he's probably very much Japanese. We don't know where his ancestors came from, but most likely came from Korea. But again, we don't know that for sure. But because the emperor is looked on as being divine, that guarantees that nobody who's not of royal blood has ever tried to usurp the office of emperor in Japan. Now, most of the emperors have been mere figureheads and have not amounted to anything. Just the rule has actually been done by the prime ministers and the generals, the warlords who come and go, while the emperor remains the in isolation, living in a magnificent palace, as inaccessible to the public as any god could be. We believe the first inhabitants of Japan were primitive, lived by hunting, fishing, and food gathering. They probably arrived around 500–600 BCE. I personally would suspect that they arrived shortly after these islands became, where the volcanoes that made the islands became quiet. And a bunch of people found these islands, and they got there and they lived by hunting. But some people believe they knew about agriculture. Eventually, Japan learned how to grow rice, probably around the year 400, about the time Europe was declining. Then Japanese farming underwent a change. Now, when Japanese farmers grow rice, they not only grow the rice, but because rice has to be buried underwater for part of its life, they put koi fish in the rice paddies. And they then can harvest both the koi and eat the koi and the rice. Koi, goldfish. Again, koi fish make excellent fish for an outdoor pond, just like goldfish. Most fish you cannot put in a pond outside. But yes, I have a fish pond, and yes, I have some koi, and I also have some goldfish. Anything else you put there. Now, you might could put some cat. Anything else you put there, though, will not survive the winter. Anyway, now, eventually the Yayoi, the first group of Japanese were the Jomon. Then it's now believed that the Yayoi, let me just see how that word is spelled. That these are these offshoots from the Jomon. And most Japanese today are descended from the Yayoi. And the Japanese at first formed small tribes headed by a chieftain, but eventually one of them became the supreme ruler. This was made necessary because of the threat of China. They faced a constant threat of the Chinese coming in and trying to conquer them. So this forced them to unite. And they united under an emperor who claimed to be divine. And this was believed and is still believed by a lot of Japanese to this day. Eventually, the Japanese government got control of all the farmland, and only 1/5 of Japan's land could be farmed. But the Japanese government got control of all the farmland, so all the farmers became government workers, and they paid their taxes to the state, paid directly to the central government. Religiously, Buddhism was introduced to them, but Buddhism did not make much headway in Japan. Instead, the Japanese formed a new religion we call Shinto. Now, I want to state this about the Japanese and the religion. If you don't know anything about Japanese religion, don't feel bad, because the Japanese are generally the least devoted to their religion of any people on the face of the earth. Especially this is true after World War II. They have never been really a very religious people per se, but again, even less so lately. But Shintoism is their official religion, and it emphasizes, among other things, that the emperor is divine, the emperor can do no wrong. The civil service exams were practiced in Japan, but only to people who are of noble birth. They were not democratic. Now, basically what I'm getting at is Japan, from the beginning of its history, practiced a strongly centralized government, and only the people who were high-born were accepted into government positions. And this was eventually to lead to Japan siding with Germany and Italy in World War II. The three countries all believed that the power of the state was supreme and the state could do no wrong. The state was to be obeyed without question. And therefore they were somewhat compatible that way. They fought a war against mostly democratic countries, except for the Soviet Union, who was forced to join our side. and Japan and Germany and Italy lost, and it was a setback for autocracy. Japan's history, and again, we could go into more detail, we have to be brief. It's like a pendulum. It goes back and forth between the central government being strong on the one hand, then when people get tired of something, they rebel against the central government, and the power then goes to nobility, the local leaders. Then when people get tired of the local leaders, the power swings back. It's gone back and forth, but they've at least always been united. But they went around in circles with either having the central government being the power or the local government being the power. Japan was, China tried to conquer Japan. The Mongolians tried it twice. They failed both times. I've already mentioned how Kublai Khan sent a big fleet from China. A massive typhoon came up and destroyed the fleet. This was called a kamikaze, a term that suicide pilots was to use in World War II. Now, we remember Kublai Khan, again, because he was the emperor when the European Italian man named Marco Polo visited, the Polo family visited, and served as an official in the court of Kublai Khan. China also bought something else, Japan, a disease called smallpox, and measles also. We may think of measles as being just a little innocent childhood disease, and if it affects children, most of the time American doctors can handle it. Measles can be a deadly disease, though, when it hits you as an adult. So if you get it as a child, you have little to worry about. All three of my children had it. I had it growing up, and it came and passed, and none of us will likely ever get it again. But smallpox, we eradicated smallpox, but if you look at an older person, like myself, you might see it on an arm that has 6 needles. That's the old way of vaccinating against smallpox. 6 needle places where it was hit with a needle in a hexagon shape. And we used to all carry those around on our arm. Today, a lot of you aren't even given smallpox vaccinations anymore. The Army was giving them, and in spite of the fact that I had one when I was 5, the Army insisted I get another when I was 30, because it was found that these things only keep you immune for maybe 10 years. It was one time thought you had lifetime immunity. But anyway, we've eradicated smallpox. Measles, not deadly if you catch as a child. Japan fought a lot of civil wars. And eventually, a group of a group of horsemen developed called the samurai. The samurai have been compared to the European medieval knight. There was one difference. The European knight fought with lances and shields. The samurai fought with bows and arrows, but both fought on horseback. The Japanese samurai were horsemen. The European knights also were horsemen. They fought from horses. And to learn how to shoot an arrow while your horse was going at full gallop, it took a lot of practice and a lot of skill, but the samurai learned it. The samurai had a code, just like the European knights had a code called the chivalry. The samurai code was Bushido. That's a foreign word, so I wrote it in cursive. B-U-S-H-I-D-O. Eventually, this system was dissolved. The Japanese went through a terrible civil war in which they dissolved a lot of their old forms of government. Also, let's face it, by the late 1400s, knights were outmoded with the invention of the rifle, gunpowder, and cannon. And both in Europe and in Japan, horse-mounted cavalry was eventually become a thing of the past. The struggle between local authority and central government is still going on, even in modern times. Now, social classes, the only class I'm going to ask you to learn is the bottom class, the Edda. Now, these people have been compared to the untouchables in India. They were the ones who did the menial task. They were expected, if they were born into the Edda class, to stay there. They could never rise up. They were not allowed to take the civil service exams, not allowed to be educated. Eventually, the Japanese did let the other classes, even the poorer classes, take the civil service exam, but the Edda, never, at least not until modern times. As for their women, in some areas they had equality to men, in other areas they were treated as inferiors. It varied from place to place and also varied from time to time. When Japan was at peace, generally the women elevated, and then when war broke out, the status of women went downhill, and the women lost all their gains that they'd gotten in time of peace. Today in Japan, in theory at least, the women are more nearly equal than they are in a lot of places on earth. All right, I'll have more to say about the Japanese women in a few minutes, but moving on with religion again. The Japanese religion called Shintoism not only emphasizes the divinity of the emperor and obedience to authority, it also emphasizes cleanliness, natural beauty. They generally like to surround their homes with flower gardens, at least the wealthier ones of them do. They surround their gardens and fish ponds with flower gardens also, trying to make their whole thing look pretty. And yes, the Japanese people have a lot of fish ponds. The state was looked on as being incapable of ever making a mistake. This reminds me of Mussolini in World War II. The state could never do anything wrong. They had also, Shintoism calls for a lot of ritual acts, rituals that are performed in front of a holy shrine or a holy place in most cases. And yes, they do a lot of ritual. The tea ceremony, like Great Britain, I mean, except the tea ceremony is in Japan, it's almost a religious thing. So Japanese, they are a blend of Chinese and Korean culture as well as their own. Now, I say to you about the Japanese, they've been great copiers. I can't tell you anything they've actually invented, but they have copied what other people have invented and oftentimes improved upon it. They didn't invent the automobile, but for many years they could make better cars than anybody else in the world. It seemed that way to a lot of Americans, that their cars are better than anyone else's. Again, they were copiers. And yes, when I was at Lockheed, some Japanese came over and looked at our machines, and they were wearing their suit and tie, and they would crawl up under a greasy machine with their suit on and scribble down notes and look at what they saw. Then they went back to Japan and made a better machine than we had. We bought one of their machines from them called, well, two of them, called a Shinippon Koki, which I helped assemble. Eventually, all the machinery Lockheed had was taken out. Became obsolete after a few years. Now, something folk, now normally I don't emphasize literature, but in this case, I will. Japanese have a type of poetry, linked verse, known as haiku. Now, I asked the class this morning, and 15 students, not a one of them act like they ever heard of haiku poetry. Have any of you heard of? All right, a few hands, a few heads are nodding. Essentially, haiku consists of 3 lines, and the first line consists of something like 5 syllables, the second one 7, I believe, and the third one 4, if I'm on the right track. And to me, it appears that the first 2 lines lead you one way, then the third line jerks you back real hard the other way. That's my impression of haiku poetry. One reason I remember it so well was when I was 15 years old, a sophomore in Madison High School. Our teacher, Mrs. McLeod by name, asked us all to write a haiku poem. I couldn't do it. I've seen a lot of haiku poetry since. I'm still not sure I could do it, but some of my classmates wrote excellent haiku poems. But again, now, linked verse, known as haiku. All right. Now, folk, I want to transfer a little bit to the 21st century. Today, the Japanese people are known as being the absolute least religious people on earth. Not much at all devoted to the religion. And even your book, the authors of this book, blamed that on the very, very high suicide rate among Japanese young people. the Japanese young people get together on the internet with their computers and agree, you commit suicide here, at the same time I'll be committing it over here miles away, at the same time this other person will be committing suicide over there, and they will commit mass suicides quite a ways apart. This has gone on in Japan from time to time. In addition, any war, folk, is usually followed by a period of a baby boom when the war is over. Japan was no exception. When World War II ended, their women had a lot of babies up until about the year 1948. For 3 or 4 years after the war, then the whole world got on this birth control idea, and they said, we must limit our births. We must somehow limit our population. There's too many people on the earth. And the Japanese led the way. I mean, everywhere they went, they were listened to, because in the land of Japan, they had no religious feelings against any form of birth control, including abortion and infanticide. That's killing a baby after he's born, or after he or she is born. If the parents had the baby for a few weeks and decided the parents didn't want the baby, they could simply legally kill it. Birth control of all kinds was practiced. The result was they limited their population too well. And today in Japan, about a couple years ago, it made world news for the first time. Japan is selling more diapers for old people than they're selling for babies. I mean, this may sound funny, but I mean, actually, it shows, well, your authors will tell you, this is in the book, if you take second semester world history, the Japanese people are aging. They're gray. I mean, they're really aging. And well, everybody ages, everybody gets old and dies, yes, but they're getting old and dying without having babies to take the place of the ones that die. And if that rate continues, within 50 years, it's estimated there might hardly be a Japanese person left. In the land of Japan, the women are not the least bit interested in marriage, in babies, in sex, or any of that. All they're interested in is career. And the men are wondering, well, what are we going to do? Now, I said this to a class not too long ago, and one of the Japanese girls said, well, all the men are interested in is pornography. I said, okay, dying is still dying. I mean, I'm not talking about dying individually. We all do that. I'm talking about where you die and the whole race of you dies, the whole ethnic group of you dies without being replaced by a new generation. So they're that kind of dying, and dying is still dying regardless of the excuse you use for why you're dying. As for pornography, folk, when I said this in the morning class, I got big laughs. I don't care. It's highly addictive. It will likely destroy your marriage, and it will destroy your ability to have sex with your regular life. Hey, I want to tell you something. I mean, I've heard this. I mean, the men who are taking Viagra and Cialis are in their 20s and 30s. The men in their 60s and 70s are not having to take it. No, I've never taken it. Don't need to. Yeah, and I'm 66. But the men in their 20s and 30s are having to take it, and I think a lot of it has to do with just that issue, pornography, destroying their ability to perform. And I'm not the only person to say that, to think that either. All right, having said that, anybody have any questions about Japan? Okay. We'll leave Japan, go on to Korea. Korea has been strongly influenced by China. Again, most people who go from China to Korea do it across the ocean, even though you can go around by land and get to Korea by land from China. Now, some people think the Koreans might have come from China, but the fact is the Korean people, folk, we don't know where they came from. Now, if you study their DNA, the only thing they have in common with the rest of humanity is like all other humans, they're all descended from, their women are descended from Eve and the men descended from Adam. Other than that, they don't. They claim, all right, folks, you can laugh, you will. They claim that they came from another planet and was transported here, which is a claim that I seriously, strongly do not believe and strongly doubt. But nevertheless, there have been persons who have studied races and trying to line up humans, and they've actually assigned the Koreans as a separate race entirely, not Mongolian. The Chinese are considered Mongoloid, and Japanese also. The Koreans, separate from any one of them. The fact is, we don't know where the Koreans originally came from. They're different from the other Asian people. The Han Dynasty conquered them way back around the time of Christ. But then when the Han Dynasty declined, Korea was able to throw off the Chinese. But then Japan came in and they conquered them. Basically, Korea has oftentimes shifted back and forth throughout its history between China and Japan. They've often been disunited. Now, today, I'm transferring to 2015. I had a girl in this morning's class who had no idea that North Korea and South Korea were disunited, and North Korea takes shots at South Korea every once in a while. Hopefully all of you, most of you have heard that. But every few years, I mean, recently as 2011, I believe, North Korea killed a bunch of South Korean Marines on an island, and North Korea would fire its missiles, but there's a threat of war. But the two sides hate each other and have, in fact, we had a war fought in Korea between 1950 and 1953. But anyway, North Korea is affiliated today closely with Communist China, and South Korea affiliated with the United States. Anyway, Korea eventually formed three kingdoms, and eventually one of the kingdoms got strong enough to drive out the Chinese, drive out the Japanese, and make Korea united for just a short time. Eventually this dynasty was, the dynasty is called the Silla, don't worry about it. What I want you to learn is they have been disunited and influenced by foreigners most of their history. And this is still true today. Buddhism came in and was introduced, and Buddhism became the official religion of all the Korean kingdoms, and this was true until modern times. Now, transport yourself to 2015, you're here. And then Korea, South Korea, is the most Christian nation on the face of the earth, but it's half Christian and half Buddhist. And the other religions have not made much headway, half and half. As for North Korea, they're either mostly communist or Buddhist. Korea is not a good farming region. The land is bad. However, when it was divided in 1950, North Korea got what was the best of the farmland, and South Korea got the worst of the farmland. Now, keep this in mind. I'm being careful about that. The North Koreans got the best of the farmland. All right. And the North Koreans are starving. Wait a minute, didn't I just say that North Korea got the best of farmland? Yeah, I did. How come they're starving? Because they adopted communism. And pure, simple communism is designed to not work, but its followers don't realize it. And the North Koreans blame all their problems on the United States, and that's a surefire way to guarantee that their problems will never be solved. Yes?
But most of the people that live there don't want to keep following it. It's just the promise
the people, I'm glad you said that. Yeah, it's imposed on them, forced on them. As for South Korea, because they couldn't farm, they became industrialized, and they make the Kia and the Hyundai, among other things. They make motorcycles, they make pianos, musical instruments, electronic equipment, and they have gotten fairly wealthy by industrialization. All right, but anyway, that's jumping ahead a little bit. But anyway, South Korea, main part of Korea also set up the civil service exam. But what brought down the Silla dynasty? They took the land from the rich, such as it was, and redistributed this land evenly among all the poor. Bad, 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 very bad. Sounds great. It brought down the government. It created a whole lot of unrest. It did not make the poor any better off. I can't explain it, folks. All I know is everywhere it's been tried, it never worked. And Solon was wise enough to not do it in Athens, where Solon went to Egypt. Maybe Egyptian sages reminded him, hey, don't redistribute the land among the poor. Maybe they knew or the fault in it. But this was tried in Mexico even not too long ago. It always has failed. And it brought down the Silla government. Civil war ensued, and from the Civil War came the Koryo dynasty. The Koryo dynasty, from which we get the name Korea. There's only been two countries I know of that's named after its ruling family. Korea, named after Koryo, and Saudi Arabia, named after the Saudi family. All right. The Koryo dynasty ruled Korea for 400 years. And they were able to prosper for a while, owing to the weakened state of China and the fact that the Great Wall of China helped to keep the Koreans helped to keep the Mongolians out of Korea, or helped keep the Mongolians out. Eventually the Mongolians found a way to get in, and they took over Korea and held it for a while. Yes. The Koryo ruled for about 400 years. And then at this point, when their rule was over, the Mongolians took over for a while, but eventually the Koreans were able to throw out the Mongolians, and that's where our part of the study ends for now. Now, if you take second semester world history, you'll have more to say. We'll have more to say about Korea. Eventually, the United States was to fight a war in Korea that was fought to a standstill. All right, leaving Korea, Vietnam. We get to name Vietnam because the earliest inhabitants, I've got to remember to replace that marker, were the Viets. All right, that's where we get to name Vietnam. Vietnam, like China, Vietnam, like Korea, had to struggle against China. The Chinese came down. Eventually, the Chinese conquered Vietnam and held it for 1,000 years. However, while they were in the process, and I had one woman write a paper about it, this is not in your book, but there was a woman leader who led them. I mean, the Vietnamese people fled to the mountains, and there in the mountains they resisted the Chinese valiantly, and this one woman tried to rally them and tried to defeat the Chinese to no avail. China was bigger, and they were able to overcome the Vietnamese. Then China began to try to civilize the Vietnamese people. They introduced Confucianism and Buddhism. And folk, as is the case of a lot of the people in this area, they chose Buddhism. And maybe because Buddhism is not as industrious, I mean, generally tropical people is not industrious, but Hinduism is a religion like for the industrious, Confucianism for the industrious and hardworking, Buddhism for the contemplative, meditative. But they embraced Buddhism more than did Confucianism, which was okay for the Chinese. Taoism also spread to Vietnam. Now, there was another problem the Chinese had with them. The Viets would oftentimes, their couples would start living together without the benefit of a marriage ceremony. The Chinese said, hey, this is uncivilized. Before you couples start living together, you need to marry. Eventually, the practice of just starting to live together without the benefit of a ceremony was outlawed. And the Viets began to have a wedding ceremony before they would start living together. And this supposedly made them more civilized and made them more like the Chinese, and gave their children more of a feeling of, well, we know who our father is, and gave them more of a family coherence, because let's face it, couples who just simply walk into their home together, sort of together, one oftentimes has a much easier time simply getting up and walking out. If that offends you, maybe I'm supposed to offend some people. I mean, I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry either. I mean, I can tell what I think about the subject. Yes, well, your union will get more respect if you go through the ceremony, and your children will be more sure of their identities and who they are in the world if you go through that ceremony. Folk, it is important. If you disagree, I'll be quiet. I'll let you talk. Nobody. All right, but anyway, China went through the same thing with the Vietnamese and eventually convinced the Vietnamese. All right. Now, as has put true in the 20th century, North and South struggled in Vietnam. Went back and forth. The South started out winning. The Viets were the North. Eventually, the North won, just like in the 20th century. The South was winning at first, but eventually the North won. And the North united Vietnam, and that's where it gets the name Vietnam. The Viets used guerrilla warfare, which they have used time to time. Well, the Mongolians came in. And the Mongolians would try to fight from horseback with their swords. That doesn't work very well in the jungle. The Vietnamese were able to drive them out. The Mongolians made some headway in Vietnam for a while, but then the Vietnamese guerrillas came in, and they would strike, and the Mongolians didn't know where they were and where they were going to hit. And they didn't have radar to detect or global positioning systems. I mean, the Vietnamese knew the jungle pretty well. And to make long story short, the Mongolians finally left. They said, we can't handle this. Vietnamese then were independent now, and they copied the Chinese. They set up a civil service exam, and unlike Korea and unlike Japan, everybody, every man, it is not the women, but every man was allowed to take it. The women were not. Now, something else too about Korea and Vietnam, they never did embrace Shintoism. Shintoism seems to be just unique to Japan only. For one thing, in the case of Vietnam, they did not have a nobility. They didn't have an upper class. They were more egalitarian. They had leaders, but their leader usually came from whoever could rise up, not necessarily a hereditary ruler. They were very egalitarian. And therefore, this just simply meant that their mindset just simply was not conducive to Shintoism. So Shinto never made much headway, any headway in Korea and Vietnam. The women in Vietnam were more equal. I mean, I just said, I know a minute ago, that the women could not take the civil service exam, but they had more rights than a lot of other Asian women, much more than the Chinese women, and also Vietnamese women could legally divorce their husbands. This was not always true in China or Japan. Again, to summarize up, Korea and Vietnam's 20th century wars were a repeat of the wars they had all down through their history. In the case of Korea, it was often north against south. In the case of Vietnam, I mean, Vietnam is a long, thin country. By the way, Vietnam is separated from Cambodia by some really ragged, steep mountains that form a clear dividing line between the two. But in the case of Vietnam, they often struggled among themselves. Vietnam spent a lot of its time, its history, being conquered by China. Japan never was. As for Korea, they often were passed back and forth between China and Japan, and this was even true up to World War II. The Japanese are notorious for having treated the Koreans very terribly in World War II, and to this day, Japanese history books will not acknowledge that their people ever did anything wrong. Folks, this is standard history talking about, and it is in the book, second volume, that is. But the wars remind us a lot of the wars that they have fought all the way down through a lot of their history. Wars with outsiders. Vietnam fought the same way, and against the United States they've always fought and have the distinction of being the only nation as of this moment that has ever whipped the United States in a war. I just have to state that the United States has not really won an all-out big war since it won World War II. Korea was a draw. Vietnam was a loss. And we got all the nations of the earth back together to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in 1990. Had a person a couple of semesters ago said right here where Ellen sitting, said the United States cannot be conquered. Nobody in the class agreed with him, and I could not agree with him less. All right, having said that, time will tell. The United States will have to change its ways. You can't fight a nice war. All right, having gone through that, I'll spend the rest of the time reviewing. By the way, who knows where is Tibet? I pointed out on the map here, but maybe most of you didn't notice. Who knows? Where's Tibet? Yes?
Isn't it that central mountain region in China?
Central is the wrong word to use. You got the right idea. It's actually more to the west. This is Tibet, south and western part of China. This is another part of China called Sangking or something like that. This is Tibet. It's very mountainous, part of the Himalayan mountains. Yeah, it's in the western part of China. More west than southwest. All right, it borders India. It's been free from China for a while, then conquered, then reconquered, then freed, and the communists reconquered it. And a lot of Americans don't like that, but our president will not do anything to offend the Chinese, so he will not talk to the Dalai Lama. All right, India. Let's see. What do you know about the dress style of India that was true until about 50 years ago? Indian dress styles were traditional, yeah. Very, very loose fitting, again, owing to India's hot tropical climate. The loose fitting clothing kept a lot of the heat out and kept the sun out. In India, when a woman's husband died, what was the wife expected to do? Burn herself. It seems hard to believe, folks, but that's in the book, and that's what I've heard from people who lived in there. This practice now has since been outlawed. As far as I know, it is not going on now. But anyway, did Islam ever conquer all of India? No. They got the wild part of it, you might say, the desert-like parts. When they got the part that was thick with vegetation, they were slowed down. Of course, by that time, too, the armies of India had learned, hey, we're not going to fight with elephants anymore. They started fighting with horses, and they started using the same tactics that the Muslims were using. And then the Muslim world got distracted by Genghis Khan and by Tamerlane and all these things. Then the Muslim world started fighting. Pakistan started fighting against Persia, and Persia started fighting against Turkey, and the Islamic world started fighting among themselves, and that kept them from overspreading the whole globe. Did Buddhism ever completely take over and dominate India? They came close to it. They looked like they might. They were making a lot of headway, but they got to a certain point. Before they actually got on the top, they were stopped, partly because Hinduism made reforms. Same thing happened in China. Confucianism stayed on top. Buddhism threatened, Taoism threatened, but then Confucianism reformed itself and attracted followers. But Confucianism until 1949 has always been the dominant religion of China. Let's see. Oh yes, the Chinese slanted their civil service exams toward what worldview? They had their civil service exam which helped to guarantee that only certain types of people would qualify. It was slanted towards what? And folk I emphasize, spent about 5 minutes talking about it. Who remembers? Confucius. They slanted their civil service exam toward Confucianism. Yeah, that is in the book. The Grand Canal. The Chinese two rivers flow from west to east. The Grand Canal went north to south and helped unite North and South China. It joined which two rivers? Yangtze and Yellow. And we have a river nearby called the Yellow River. It's nothing compared to China's Yellow River. In fact, the Yellow River is a little more here. It's a little more than a creek, but it is yellow in color in places, owing to the rocks that's around it. Yeah. Yangtze and the Yellow River. China has a river called the Yellow River. Reminds me of our Yellow River we have right here, which some of you might even know it here. Which Chinese dynasty was conquered by the Mongolians? I heard somebody say it. Which Chinese dynasty? I call them a socialistic dynasty. The Song, that's spelled S-O-N-G in English. They're called the Sung dynasty, conquered by the Mongolians. By the way, somebody said, haven't you talked about Genghis Khan before? Remind us about history. It's especially true when you take second semester history. You'll run into Adolf Hitler when you study American history. You'll run into Adolf Hitler when you study French history. You'll run into Adolf Hitler again when you study English history. And of course, when you study German history, he was influential in all of Europe. So any history you study, he'll be there. And the same way with Genghis Khan, you bump into him when you study Islam history, when you study Russian history, even though he never went to Russia, his troops did. And you run into him when you study Chinese history as well as Mongolian history. So you oftentimes run into the history overlaps, is what I'm trying to say. All right. Let's see. Oh yeah. What did the Chinese primarily have against Buddhism? It was a what? They didn't like it because it was an outside religion, a foreign religion. It had started in India. Confucianism and Taoism had been started by Chinese people. Let's see. Oh yeah, none of these countries we've talked about, China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, none of them allowed women to take the civil service exam. That was an innovation by Europeans who came along later, when Europeans and Americans copied the idea in the 1600s. I mean, probably in the 17 and 1800s. All right. Down through history, what has been like mankind's most deadly disease that has wiped out millions of people throughout? Smallpox. It wiped out between smallpox and typhus, disease helped wipe out 90% of the American Indian population. Smallpox. Speaking of diseases, they found a girl, I believe, in somewhere in the West. I keep wanting to think it was Oregon, who has the bubonic plague. I don't know if any of you heard that or not, but the bubonic plague is back. Any of you happen to hear that? One of you, yeah. They found a girl diagnosed with the bubonic. And it's a small one because most doctors don't even know how to treat it. They had to dig up their old books to find out, what it was and how to treat it. But she's expected to make a recovery. Say again?
How does she get that?
That I don't think anybody knows. I mean, it's caught. In time past, it was caught by not mosquitoes, but by fleas that lived off the bodies of rats. And the rats would attract the fleas, and then the fleas would jump on the humans when they were near. We'll talk more about that when we come to chapter 12. We'll spend the rest of the semester after the test on Monday talking about European history, chapters 12 and 13, and we'll run into the bubonic plague again. So I guess it's still with us. All right, everybody, have a good weekend.